The evening sun cast golden hues through the kitchen window, painting the room in warm amber tones. The scent of baked lasagna filled the air, mingling with the low hum of the television in the living room. It was a scene of quiet domesticity, peaceful, familiar, almost picture-perfect. David stood by the stove, his sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot of sauce with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Across the room, his sons, Alex and Ryan, bickered over who had to set the table, another ritual in their household. "I did it yesterday," Ryan protested, arms crossed. "And I did it the day before," Alex shot back. David sighed, shaking his head. "Then let's be fair. Ryan, you do it today. And Alex, you handle the dishes later. Deal?" Ryan groaned but complied, shuffling to grab the plates. Alex smirked triumphantly. It was a small, mundane moment, yet it spoke volumes about their bond. This was their family, just the three of them. It had always been just the three of them. But under the surface, there was something else, a weight that David had carried for years, buried beneath layers of responsibility and unspoken truths. David wasn't supposed to be a single father. He had once believed in the fairy tale, a wife, 2 kids, a house with a white picket fence. But life had a cruel way of rewriting dreams. His wife, Emily, had walked out on them when Ryan was only 5, leaving behind nothing but a short note and a legal agreement. "I can't do this anymore. You're a good father, David, but I need more. More." The word had haunted him for years. What had he done wrong? Had he not been enough? But the more painful realization had come later. She had never truly loved him the way he had loved her. So David did what any good father would do. He buried the pain, picked up the broken pieces, and made sure his boys never felt the absence of a mother. For years, he convinced himself that was all that mattered. Being a good father. Being enough. But enough came at a cost. A part of him had disappeared along the way. David's mother, Eleanor, had never approved of how he lived his life. "A home needs a woman, David," she would say, every time they had Sunday dinner together. "Boys need a mother, and you need a wife." It was always said with love, always wrapped in the warm concern of a mother who believed she knew best. But David saw through it. It wasn't about him. It was about appearances, about legacy. The Williamson family name had meant something for generations. His father had been a respected businessman. His uncles were all successful, married men with perfect families. He was the only one who had failed. A divorcee, a single father, a man without a woman beside him, and that made him incomplete in her eyes. So every year, every holiday, every gathering, she pushed. "It's not too late. David, I know a lovely woman from church. I can set up a meeting." And every time, he gave the same answer. "I'm happy. Mom, it's just me and the boys. We're fine." But was he? David had spent years avoiding the truth. Not because he was ashamed, not because he didn't know, but because he had never allowed himself to think about it. He had always been so busy being a father, so busy playing the role of the responsible, self-sacrificing man, that he had forgotten to ask himself one simple question. What do I want? It was a terrifying question, because the answer was something he had locked away since he was a teenager, since before he met Emily, since before he convinced himself that love was something he had to perform, rather than something he could simply feel. But now, for the first time in years, he felt it again. A spark, a pull toward something more, and he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. Dinner that night felt like any other. Ryan cracked jokes about school. Alex complained about his upcoming exams. David listened, laughed, and nodded at all the right times. But inside, his mind was racing, because he had made a decision. No more hiding, no more pretending. The weight that had been on his chest for years was about to be lifted. But he also knew, the moment he spoke his truth, their world would never be the same. If you want to see how David's secret unravels, how his family reacts, and the shocking drama that follows, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments. This is just the beginning. The real storm is coming. The dining table was set, the plates clinking softly as Ryan passed the breadbasket to Alex. The scent of roasted chicken filled the room, blending with the low murmur of evening conversations. It was a routine that had played out countless times before, familiar, comfortable, predictable. But tonight, David was restless. He could hear his mother's voice in his head. Her words like a relentless drumbeat. A home needs a woman. David, you are not complete without a wife. The boys need a mother. It was always the same argument, disguised as concern but laced with unshakable judgment. And for years, he had played along, dodging, deflecting, pretending that the single life was simply his choice, rather than a consequence of a truth he had never dared to speak. But tonight, something was different. David had made a decision, a terrifying, irreversible decision. And as he sat there, watching his sons laugh and tease each other like they always did, he wondered if this would be the last normal dinner they would ever have. "Dad, you're quiet tonight," Alex said, raising an eyebrow as he reached for his glass of water. Ryan, always the more observant one, leaned in slightly. "Yeah, something wrong?" David hesitated. His hands tightened around the edge of his napkin, the weight of years pressing down on him like a tidal wave. He could feel it creeping in, the fear, the doubt, the desperate urge to retreat before it was too late. What if they didn't take it well? What if he lost them? "It's nothing," he finally said, forcing a small smile. "Just a long day." Alex nodded, but Ryan kept his eyes on his father for a moment longer, as if sensing something unsaid beneath the surface. And then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for the perfect moment to push him, the front door opened. "David!" The sharp, commanding voice of Eleanor Williamson sliced through the air like a blade. His mother strode into the room, her presence as formidable as ever. Even in her late 60s, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime ensuring the world around her operated exactly as she believed it should. "You didn't answer my calls," she said, her eyes narrowing as she took a seat at the head of the table, a position she had claimed, as if by birthright, every time she visited. David suppressed a sigh. He knew why she was here. "Mom, we're having dinner. Can this wait?" "No," she said simply, placing her handbag down beside her. "It cannot." Alex and Ryan exchanged glances. They had seen this play out before. And then, with an air of practiced authority, Eleanor folded her hands and smiled, a tight, calculated smile. "I spoke to Linda today," she began. "Her daughter is single. Lovely girl. Teaches at the elementary school. I told her you'd be interested." David felt his stomach drop. "Mom, don't interrupt me," she said smoothly, as if this were just another business meeting to be handled. "She's family-oriented. Good values. Wants children. Mom." This time, his voice was firm. Eleanor's eyes flickered, a shadow of surprise passing over her features before she straightened. "David, you need a wife." She gestured vaguely at the table, at his sons, at everything he had built on his own. "This is not how a proper family should be. You know that." There it was, the judgment, the disapproval, the unspoken disappointment that had hung over him for years. And suddenly, something inside David snapped. He couldn't do this anymore. "Mom, I'm seeing someone." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Eleanor blinked. For a brief moment, she looked pleased. "Well, that's a relief," she said. "And who is she?" Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. David could feel Alex and Ryan stiffen beside him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. But it was too late now. So he said it. "It's not a she." The room went deathly quiet. Eleanor's smile froze. Her grip on the table tightened, her knuckles turning white. Alex let out a slow breath. Ryan's fork clattered against his plate. And then, in a voice so sharp it could have shattered glass, Eleanor whispered, "Excuse me?" David didn't look away. "I'm seeing someone," he repeated. His name is James. Eleanor pushed back from the table so abruptly that her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. No. A single word, filled with absolute finality. Mom, no. David. Her voice was shaking. Not with sadness, but with rage. Don't you dare sit there and tell me this is real. This is not how I raised you. This is not our family. This is disgusting. Ryan flinched. Alex's jaw clenched. David felt his world tilt. But he didn't back down. Mom, I'm done lying. This is who I am. Eleanor's breathing was unsteady. Her hands trembled as she rose from the table, and for the first time in his life, David saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Hate! I want no part of this. She spat, turning toward the door. If you choose this, don't bother calling me again. And just like that, she was gone. The front door slammed shut. The room was silent. For the first time in his life, David had spoken his truth. And in doing so, he had lost the only family he had ever known. The house felt different that night. Eleanor was gone, but the weight of her words still lingered in the air, thick like a storm cloud that refused to break. The door slam had echoed long after she had left, leaving behind a house that suddenly felt colder. David sat at the dining table, his hand still resting on the polished wooden surface. His plate was untouched. His stomach was twisted into knots. Across from him, Alex and Ryan sat frozen, staring at their father like he was a stranger. The tension was suffocating. Ryan, who was usually the first to break the silence, said nothing. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if searching for something, an explanation, maybe even a way to turn back time. Alex's face was unreadable, his fingers drumming against the table, the only sound in the quiet room. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. So, you're gay? His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was just a question, laced with genuine curiosity and something else, disbelief. David took a deep breath. I'm bisexual. Another silence. And you're dating a guy? Ryan finally asked, his voice quieter, hesitant. David nodded. Yes. His name is James. That was it. The words were out. No taking them back now. Ryan blinked. Alex let out a slow exhale, rubbing his face like he was processing an unexpected plot twist in a movie. Wait, hold on. Ryan raised his hands, as if trying to physically slow everything down. James? As in James? The guy who fixed our deck last summer? David hesitated, then nodded. Yes, that James. Ryan's mouth fell open. Alex's eyebrows shot up, and then the most unexpected thing happened. Ryan burst out laughing. Not a chuckle, not a nervous giggle. A full-blown, hysterical laugh. David blinked, caught completely off guard. Ryan. No, hold on. Ryan gasped between laughs. You're telling me that after all these years of grandma trying to set you up with, like, 100 different women, you go and date the guy who built our deck? I mean, Dad, you really picked the most plot twist way to come out. Even Alex cracked a small smirk. The absurdity of it was undeniable. David let out a breath he didn't even realize he was holding. Ryan wasn't upset. He was amused. That had to be a good sign, right? Okay. But, Ryan's laughter started to fade as he sat up straight, still looking at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. Why now? Why after all this time? David sighed. Because I finally realized I don't want to keep pretending. He glanced down at his hands, as if searching for the right words. For years, I convinced myself that being a good father meant putting everything else aside. My feelings, my wants, it all had to come second. Because you two were my priority. Ryan and Alex exchanged a glance but didn't interrupt. But then I thought, what kind of example am I setting for you? If I tell you to be true to yourselves, but I can't even do that for myself, what kind of father does that make me? His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that his sons had never seen before. I didn't plan for this to happen, David admitted. But James, he makes me happy. And for once, I just want to let myself have that. Another beat of silence. Ryan studied his father carefully, then shrugged. Well, that makes sense, I guess. David blinked. You guess? I mean, yeah. You're kind of old to be figuring yourself out now. But hey, better late than never. David chuckled. Gee, thanks for that confidence boost. Ryan grinned. But then, his expression softened. I'm happy for you. Dad. David's heart clenched. He hadn't realized just how much he needed to hear those words until now. He looked at Alex, who had been quiet this whole time, still deep in thought. And you? David asked cautiously. Alex let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. I mean, it's a lot to process, he admitted. It's weird thinking about you dating anyone, let alone a guy, but I also know that you've been alone for a long time. And if James makes you happy, then, he shrugged. I guess that's all that matters. David felt something unfamiliar swell in his chest. Relief. For a moment, it felt like things might actually be okay. His boys accepted him. They didn't hate him. They didn't resent him. Maybe this wouldn't be the disaster he feared. But then Ryan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his face instantly fell. Shit, he muttered. What? Alex frowned. Ryan swallowed hard. His fingers hovered over his phone for a second before he turned the screen around, showing them a group chat filled with texts. Dude, is it true? Your dad's dating a guy? Bro, that's wild. No wonder he never remarried. That's just wrong. Bet your grandma's having a meltdown. David felt his stomach drop. It was already happening. Word was getting out. And not everyone was as understanding as his sons. Alex's jaw clenched. Ryan swore under his breath. The world outside their home was about to turn against them. And this time, David wasn't the only one who would have to face the consequences. The next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't just the lingering tension from the previous night. It wasn't just the silence that came after a confession that shattered the very foundation of their family. It was the anticipation of something worse. David could feel it in his bones, the calm before the storm. And then, at exactly 8 a.m., it came. The front door slammed open so hard the walls shook. David Williamson! Eleanor had arrived. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the house like a blade. Fury radiated from her in waves, her presence alone enough to make the air feel suffocating. David barely had time to set down his coffee before she stormed into the living room, her heels clicking against the wooden floor with the weight of her rage. How dare you? Her voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with pure, unfiltered anger. Mom, don't you mom me, she snapped, eyes blazing. I spent my entire life raising you to be a good man, a proper man. And this is how you repay me? By shaming this family? Alex and Ryan, half awake, appeared at the top of the stairs. They exchanged a wary glance. They had seen Grandma upset before, but never like this. This was different. This was war. Mom, lower your voice, David said, forcing himself to remain calm. Lower my voice? Eleanor practically shrieked. You've embarrassed this family. Do you have any idea what people are saying? She yanked her phone out of her purse and threw it onto the coffee table. The screen still lit up with an unread message. Have you heard about David? I can't believe it. What's Eleanor going to do now? That's just wrong. So disappointing. David felt his stomach drop. It had begun. You are the talk of the entire neighborhood. Eleanor spat. The church, the country club, the family. Do you even care what you've done? What I've done, David repeated, voice finally sharpening. I told the truth. That's all I did. Eleanor scoffed. The truth? The truth should have been buried with your shame. David's jaw clenched. You raised me to be a good man, he said evenly. And a good man doesn't live a lie. A good man follows the rules. Whose rules? The rules of decency, of family, of respect. She was shaking now, hands clenched into fists. For the first time, David saw something beyond her fury. Fear. I built a life for you. she whispered, voice breaking slightly. "I fought for this family's reputation, and now you've thrown it all away." "He didn't throw anything away." Alex's voice cut through the room. Eleanor turned, eyes narrowing at her grandson. "This isn't the 1950s. Grandma," Alex said, stepping forward. "Dad isn't some disgrace to the family just because he decided to stop pretending." Ryan, standing beside him, crossed his arms. "Yeah, and honestly, if your reputation can't survive the fact that Dad wants to be happy, then maybe it was never worth much to begin with." Eleanor's face darkened. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she hissed. "No, Grandma," Alex shot back. "I think we do. You care more about what the neighbors think than about Dad's happiness." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, she looked truly shaken, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "You'll regret this," she whispered. "Looking at David one last time, one day, you'll realize what you've done. And when that day comes, don't come looking for me." And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked out. The door slammed shut behind her, and for a moment, all David could do was breathe. The silence that followed was deafening. David sat down heavily on the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. His own mother had just walked out of his life. And yet, that was kind of badass, Ryan muttered. David let out a tired laugh. "Was it?" "Well, except for the part where she basically disowned you," Alex admitted. "But yeah, standing up to Grandma like that. Legendary." David exhaled slowly. "You guys really don't care, do you?" Ryan shrugged. "I mean, it's weird, but you're still Dad. That hasn't changed." Alex nodded. "And James is actually kind of cool. So, yeah, I guess we're good." David felt something warm settle in his chest. His mother had walked away, but his sons, they were still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered. Or at least, that's what he thought. Because Eleanor wasn't done, and neither was the world outside their home. At first, it was just whispers, the kind that lingered in grocery store aisles, exchanged in hushed voices between women pretending to browse the shelves. It spread through the local diner, murmured over cups of steaming black coffee, between bites of pancakes and forced smiles. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, the entire town knew. David Williamson, the man who had spent years raising 2 boys on his own, respected for his quiet strength and dedication, was now a scandal. The kind of scandal that didn't just fade, the kind that people fed on, the kind that made him a target. David wasn't naive. He had expected some pushback. What he hadn't expected was the full-force rejection of a town he had called home for decades. The first sign came on Monday morning. David walked into his usual coffee shop, greeted the barista, a girl named Lena, who had been making his coffee for 3 years now. Except this time, she wouldn't meet his eyes. She took his order, but her voice was clipped, her tone cold. When his coffee came, the name scrawled on the cup was no longer David. It was Sinner. He stared at it for a long moment, heart pounding. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe someone thought they were being funny. But when he turned around, he caught the eyes of an older man in the corner booth, Mr. Jacobs, a retired school principal, someone who had once shaken his hand and called him a fine role model. Now? No. He just looked at David like he was something dirty. It got worse from there. That night, Ryan came home from school looking furious. "I almost got into a fight today," he said, throwing his backpack down. David's stomach tightened. "What happened?" Ryan scoffed. "Some asshole in my class said you were a disgrace. Said no wonder Mom left." David felt the air leave his lungs. "Ryan, I punched him in the face." "You what?" "He deserved it." "Ryan, violence isn't the answer. Neither is standing there and taking it." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "Did the school call?" "No," Ryan muttered. "But if they do, I don't regret it." The final straw came on Wednesday. David had been working for the same construction firm for 10 years. He wasn't just another employee. He was one of the best project managers they had. But when he walked into the office that morning, he felt it instantly. The silence. The avoidance. Then, his boss, Mark Reynolds, a man who had once invited him over for backyard barbecues, called him into his office. "David, you know I respect you," Mark started, leaning back in his chair. David already knew where this was going. "But we've been getting complaints." "Complaints?" "From clients," Mark sighed. "They're uncomfortable. A few have even threatened to pull their business if we don't handle the situation." David clenched his fists beneath the desk. "Handle the situation? So, what? You're firing me?" Mark winced. "No, not exactly. But maybe you should take some time off. Let things cool down." Cool down? Like he was a problem that needed to disappear. David stared at him for a long moment, then pushed back his chair and stood up. "You know what, Mark?" he said, voice calm but sharp. "If I'm too much of a problem, then you don't have to worry about me anymore." Mark looked startled. "David, come on." But David was already walking out the door. He wasn't going to beg for a job from a man who saw him as a liability instead of a person. If this town wanted to push him out, fine, but they wouldn't break him. That night, as he sat on the couch, staring at the job listings on his laptop, a realization settled in his chest. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been shamed into silence. About every kid too afraid to be themselves because of people like Eleanor, like the Jacobs of the world, like the clients who thought he was a problem. He wasn't going to let them win, and he wasn't going to disappear. David Williamson was just getting started. David had always thought of himself as a strong man. He had survived a failed marriage. He had raised 2 boys on his own. He had endured loneliness, exhaustion, and the constant pressure of being everything for everyone. But this was different. He wasn't just alone. He was isolated. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him, some filled with disgust, others with quiet pity. The weight of their stares was suffocating. The town he had called home for decades had turned its back on him. And for the first time, he felt himself slipping. That night, David sat in the dark, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. The house was silent. Ryan was upstairs, headphones on, pretending everything was fine. Alex had gone out, needing space. And David was staring at the blank television screen, thoughts spiraling. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe he had ruined everything. His job was gone. His reputation was in shambles. His kids were suffering because of him. Was this worth it? The thought came quietly at first, then louder, then unbearable. His hands trembled as he reached for the bottle again. But before he could take another sip, a voice cut through the silence. "Dad?" David looked up. Ryan stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the room, the untouched dinner on the table, the bottle, the way his father's shoulders slumped. And just like that, David felt ashamed. He had promised himself he would always be strong for his boys. And here he was, breaking in front of them. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked, stepping closer. David opened his mouth, ready to lie, to say he was fine, but he couldn't. Not this time. "No," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not." Ryan sat down beside him, silent for a moment. Then, in a voice steadier than David expected, he said, "Then let's figure it out. Together." David turned to his son, surprised. Ryan wasn't a kid anymore. He was a young man looking at his father, not with pity, not with disappointment, but with understanding. "You spent your whole life protecting us." Ryan continued, "Let us do the same for you now." David exhaled shakily, the crushing weight on his chest easing just a little. He wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, he could survive this. For them. For himself. For the life he refused to let them take away. The next morning, David woke up feeling empty. The conversation with Ryan had pulled him back from the edge. But it hadn't changed the reality of his situation. He was still jobless, still an outcast, still a disappointment in the eyes of the town, and worse, his own mother. And then, the final blow came. Alex stormed into the house, rage burning in his eyes. "Dad, You need to see this. He threw his phone onto the table. David picked it up and his stomach dropped. It was a social media post. A picture of him at the construction site. Captioned, "Remember when men were actually men? What a shame." Hundreds of comments. Some laughing, some worse. David's hands trembled. He could handle people talking. He could handle judgment. But this was humiliation. "I'm done," he muttered, setting the phone down. "I can't fight this anymore." "No," Alex said sharply. "You're not done. You're not running. And you're definitely not giving up." David looked up. And that's when Alex said the words that changed everything. "Do you remember what you told me when I got into that fight in middle school?" Alex asked, crossing his arms. David frowned, caught off guard. What? "You told me," Alex continued, "that if I backed down just because people didn't like who I was, then I'd be letting them control me." David swallowed. He had said that. "And you told me," Alex added, voice tightening, "that the hardest thing a man can do is stand tall when the world wants to break him." David felt something shift inside him. "So tell me, Dad," Alex said, leaning forward. "Where is that man now?" Silence. Ryan looked between them, eyes wide. And David, he felt his pulse in his throat, because his son was right. He had spent years teaching his boys to be strong, to be fearless, to never let anyone define their worth. And yet, here he was, ready to walk away. "I know this town sucks," Alex continued, his voice steady but emotional. "I know it's unfair, and I know it hurts. But Dad, I've never seen you as weak. Don't start now." David's breath hitched. Something hot and sharp burned in his chest. It wasn't defeat anymore. It was anger. It was determination. It was the realization that he wasn't going to let them win. David stood. For the first time in days, he felt steady. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "No more hiding." Alex smirked. "Damn right." Ryan grinned. "So what's the plan?" David looked at his sons, his family, his reason for fighting, and then, for the first time since this nightmare began, he smiled. "Let's show them who I really am." The battle wasn't over. But now, David was ready for war. David had spent his entire life trying to be the man everyone expected him to be. But now, he was done with that. So when he walked into the local diner that morning, the same diner where he had spent years drinking coffee, shaking hands, and talking business with the same men who now whispered behind his back, he walked in tall. Alex and Ryan flanked him. Their presence a silent statement. "We're not backing down." Heads turned as they entered. The whispers started instantly. "There he is. Can you believe he actually showed up? He should have just left town." David ignored them. Because today, he wasn't here to be silent. He was here to be seen. The three of them took a seat at the counter. The waitress, Debbie, a woman who had served him coffee for years, hesitated before walking over. "Morning, Debbie," David said. His voice calm but firm. She forced a smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "Coffee? Please." She poured the coffee with shaky hands. The tension was suffocating. And then, the moment he knew was coming arrived. From across the diner, Tom Jacobs, the retired school principal, stood up. "David," he said, voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Why are you still here?" The room fell silent. David turned, meeting Tom's glare head-on. "Excuse me?" Tom crossed his arms. "People like you don't belong here." Alex tensed beside him. But David lifted a hand, a silent signal to let him handle it. "People like me?" David repeated, keeping his voice level. Tom scoffed. "Don't play dumb. This town doesn't need men like you flaunting your lifestyle." A few people murmured in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. David set his coffee cup down carefully. "Let me ask you something." "Tom," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "What exactly have I done to you?" Tom blinked, caught off guard. "To me? Nothing. But to this town, you've embarrassed it. You've made a mockery of everything we stand for." David nodded slowly. He had expected this answer. And what exactly do we stand for?" he asked. Tom hesitated, and that's when David went in for the kill. "Because let me remind you, Tom, I've lived here for 20 years. I've worked my ass off, raised 2 good sons, paid my taxes, gone to every community event. I've done my part." He let the words sink in before adding, "Can you honestly say I've done anything wrong? Or is the only thing that bothers you who I love?" Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence, because Tom had no answer, and suddenly, the town wasn't just watching David. They were watching Tom. The power was shifting, and Tom knew it. So he did what all bullies do when they start losing. He got personal. "Your wife left you for a reason, David." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Ryan's hands curled into fists. Alex looked ready to throw a punch. "But David?" David laughed, a quiet chuckle at first, then a full-bodied laugh. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "That's the best you've got?" Tom frowned. He wasn't expecting that reaction. David leaned forward. "Tell me, Tom, what exactly is so scary about me being happy?" Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. Because, in that moment, he realized he had nothing left to say. And then, something incredible happened. A voice from the back of the diner spoke up. "I think he's right." Every head turned. It was Maggie, the owner of the bookstore, a woman who had been in town just as long as David. "David's a good man. Better than half the people in this town." More murmurs. Then another voice. "He fixed my roof for free last winter. Didn't even ask for anything in return. He coached my kids' baseball team when no one else would. He was the only one who showed up when my wife was in the hospital." One by one, people started speaking up. Not everyone, not enough to call it a victory, but enough to show that the town wasn't as united against him as they thought. And that was a start. Tom muttered something under his breath, grabbed his coat, and stormed out of the diner. A few of his usual followers hesitated, then followed him. But the rest stayed. David took a slow breath, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Ryan grinned. "That was epic." Alex smirked. "Told you. Never back down." David looked around. Not everyone supported him. Not everyone accepted him. But now, at least, they knew he wasn't going anywhere. And the people who mattered, they were standing beside him. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he thought he had lost. A week had passed since the showdown at the diner. David had expected things to get worse. He had expected more people to turn against him, for the whispers to grow louder, for the rejection to spread like wildfire. But instead, something had shifted. The community was still divided. There were still those who avoided him, those who scoffed when they saw him on the street. But now, there were also people who stood by him. People who refused to let the town's traditions dictate their beliefs. And most importantly, David finally felt free. For the first time in his life, he wasn't hiding. And tonight, for the first time, he wasn't eating dinner alone with his sons. Tonight, James was there too. They sat around the dinner table, the same way they always had. But this time, the air felt different. It wasn't just Ryan cracking jokes. It wasn't just Alex rolling his eyes and pretending he wasn't laughing. There was something new here. A sense of peace. A sense of normalcy. James was sitting across from David, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched the boys bicker. "I don't care what you say," Ryan declared, pointing his fork at Alex. "Michael Jordan is still better than LeBron." "You're delusional," Alex scoffed. "Dad, tell him," David chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not getting involved in this one." James smirked. "Smart man." Ryan turned to James. "Okay, you tell me, Jordan or LeBron?" James took a slow sip of his drink, then shrugged. "Kobe?" Ryan gasped in betrayal. David and Alex burst into laughter. It was simple. It was easy. And for the first time, it felt like home. After dinner, as the boys cleared the table, James stood beside David at the sink, drying the dishes. "You okay?" James asked softly. David nodded. Then, after a moment, he said, "Yeah, For the first time in a long time, I think I am. James squeezed his shoulder. Good. You deserve to be. David exhaled, looking around the kitchen, listening to the soft chatter of his sons in the next room. His mother may never accept him. The town may never fully embrace him. But here, in this house, surrounded by the people who truly mattered, he was loved, and that was all he needed. A few days later, David got a phone call. From Eleanor. He hesitated before answering. Heart pounding. Mom. David. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Eleanor sighed. I don't understand this, she admitted. I don't know if I ever will. David swallowed hard. I know. Mom, but I also know you're still my son. David closed his eyes. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't approval. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. That night, David sat with Alex and Ryan, watching an old movie. Halfway through, Ryan suddenly turned to him. You ever think about leaving? He asked. David frowned. Leaving? Yeah. Just moving somewhere new, somewhere that doesn't care so much about what people think. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, I don't want to run. Not from this town, not from anyone. Because if I do, then I'm letting them win. I'm letting them tell me who I should be. Ryan nodded slowly. So, what now? Alex asked. David smiled. Now? He leaned back, stretching his arms. Now, we live. We live exactly how we want to. No more hiding. No more shame. No more fear. Because at the end of the day, life was too damn short to waste on other people's expectations. The next morning, David woke up early. He stepped outside onto the front porch, coffee in hand. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to rise. And for the first time in his life, he felt free. Because the truth was, he had never been the problem. The problem was the people who thought love had rules. And now, he wasn't living for them anymore. Thank you for following this story. This journey was about more than just David. It was about every person who has ever been told they aren't enough. It was about standing your ground, even when the world wants to break you. So let me ask you, have you ever had to fight for who you are? What gave you the strength to keep going? Share your story in the comments, like if you believe in choosing love over fear. Subscribe because we all deserve stories that inspire courage. They tried to silence him, but now he's finally found his voice.